Hi, I'm Dr. Frank A. Thomas, and it is my privilege to offer you just another powerful interview. We search America for the best preachers to bring to you. And we have today Reverend Dr. James Perkins, the retired pastor of Greater Christ Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan. Sir, thank you so much for coming and being with us. It's our honor for what you know about preaching and what we're getting ready to hear about preaching. It is an honor to have you with us.
Well, it's my delight to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Wow, well, thank you for coming. So we've got a lot to talk about, so let me get right to it. Let's get right to it. So there are many of our viewers who know who you are and have heard you preach, but just in case there might have been a few who do not know, what would you tell them about James Perkins?
Well, as you indicated, I am the recently retired pastor of the Greater Christ Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan, where I served for 42 years. Mm-hmm. I was born and reared in a small coal mining town in the southwestern part of West Virginia, Williamson, West Virginia. Mm-hmm. I was reared in a Christian home. My father was a good deacon in the church and superintendent of Sunday school. My mother was a wonderful, committed church worker. And I have 8 sisters and 5 brothers. So all of my life, I have known that I was supposed to be a preacher. There's never been a time in my life when I didn't know I was supposed to be a preacher. So as a kid, with 8 sisters and 5 brothers, for a boy 7 or 8 years old, that was a pretty good sized congregation. And occasionally I'd get my mom and dad to come to service. Right. So, for me to become a pastor and so forth was just an extension of God's move in my life.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, there was a call. So there had to be a trial sermon. So tell me about the process of how you got to Greater Christ.
First, as I mentioned, I felt like I was going to be a preacher all my life. Yeah. But when the Lord started really stirring up within me that I was supposed to be a preacher and become a pastor, I couldn't do it because the preachers that I grew up under, they would stand up and they would talk slow. We find here in this text, and the people would chime in, well, I've always talked fast. I always had kind of a nervous fidgetiness about myself. But when I went to college, the Lord again was just stirring up within me that it's time.
Where'd you go to college?
Wiley College in Marshall, Texas.
Wow, you did.
Absolute home of the great debaters.
Yes. I preached at Wiley College, so that's why I know it. But go ahead.
I told the Lord I kept fighting it. But a friend of mine introduced me, said, well, why don't you go to church with me this morning? And I did, the Bethesda Baptist Church in Marshall, Texas. And the preacher, when he stood up, he dropped his head and he started reading the sermon. But it wasn't just idle chatter, it was spiritual talking. And it was logical, it made sense, and it touched your heart. And when he raised his head and his hand at the end of the sermon, everything came up with him. And it was relief for me. I said, Lord, if this can pass as preaching, I'll do it. Because I felt like I could write something and I could read it, but just to stand up and do it as I had seen those preachers do that I grew up under, I couldn't do it. So that liberated me. So I accepted the call. I said, yes, Lord. And then that Christmas, I had called my mom and dad and told them, I've been called to preach. And my dad in his stern way, do you know what you're doing? So I said, yeah, I think so. In any case, when I went home for a Christmas break, they let me preach my trial sermon at my home church, the Second Mount Zion Baptist Church, Williamson, West Virginia. It was just a 2-Sunday church. And so I've been on this journey ever since. Growing up in the church, as I mentioned, I went to these state conventions.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a pastor there who first of all asked me, "Are you going to go to college?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Where?" I didn't know any colleges. So he's the one, he said, "Well, go to my college." "What college is that?" "Wiley College, Marshall, Texas."
Mm.
So he, by the time I graduated from seminary, a church in West Virginia where he had served called him and said, "We need a pastor." Mm-hmm. He said, "I got just the man for you." So he gave them my name.
I'm going to back up. I'm going to back you up again.
All right.
How did you get to seminary?
This pastor, John Mashak was his name, who preached the sermon at the Bethesda church,
Mm-hmm.
where I heard him reading it. I acquainted myself with him.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, "Where did you go to seminary?" He said, "Andover Newton Theological Seminary."
Mm.
So I said, "That's where I'm going."
Wow.
So I went to Andover Newton because of him and because of a book that we had in class, The Psychology of Religion.
Mm.
And the gentleman, Walter Houston, he had written that book, and he was a professor at Andover Newton.
Okay, wow.
And I wanted to go and study under him,
Mm-hmm.
only to find out after I got there, he had retired.
Wow.
Yeah, but so I got to Andover Newton. When I finished Andover Newton, I went, as I mentioned, this pastor gave this church in West Virginia, St. Paul Baptist Church, my name. They called me, so I got called out of seminary to become a pastor at St. Paul Baptist Church in West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was preaching in the Progressive Convention, and this other pastor in Detroit heard me preaching. And he said to me, "You know, I'm thinking about retiring, and I want you to come and would you consider succeeding me at my church in Detroit?"
Mm.
So I went. William J. Bishop, who was pastor of the Central Baptist Church, I went and he heard me preaching each night. He said, "You know, I wanted you to succeed me, but you're too much of a preacher for this church. But I have friends and they're looking for a pastor at their church."
Okay, wow.
So he invited them to come to the revival. They were officers at the Greater Christ Baptist Church in Detroit.
Mm.
They subsequently invited me to preach at their church.
Mm.
I preached, went on, and then they called me. And the rest is history.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's 43 years there. It's a fabulous church, wonderful, wonderful opportunity. So tell me about your preaching. Tell me about your preaching style. If you had to define or to name the style of preaching, well, how would you classify your preaching?
I don't really know how I would classify it. What I simply try to do is when I come to a text, I guess I would say exegetical, storytelling exegetical, because for me the first thing is understand the background of the text.
Yeah.
What are the events in the world at that time that's happening that this text would be produced?
Yeah.
And from there, once I get a sense of what that is, then I look for a parallel in our contemporary world.
Right. Right.
And I try to identify what is the issue in this text.
Mm-hmm.
And I start with trying to define the ancient issue again in contemporary terms,
Right.
and move from there
Right.
to say this is what we ought to do, transition into the text,
Mm-hmm.
make the relationship, the connection between the text and the issue,
Right.
and then flesh it out in these 3 points.
Mm-hmm.
And say this is what we ought to do as a result of this. And that's kind of, how I go about it. And I'm a manuscript preacher.
Yeah.
I remember when I started as a pastor in West Virginia. Now, I had taken homiletics at Andover Newton under Eddie S. O'Neill.
Okay.
I had taken homiletics at Harvard Divinity School under Dr. Gardner Taylor. But when I got to be a pastor on that weekly basis, I couldn't get a sermon. And I remember, excuse me, I remember one night on my knees crying, saying, Lord, please give me something to preach to these people. And the Lord said to me as clearly as I'm talking to you, why don't you read the Bible? And I said, you know, that's a good idea. What I discovered was that in seminary we read all the books about the Bible, but we didn't read the Bible.
Right.
So for me, I sat down that next day and I started reading the Bible from beginning to end. And it started to live. It was like a movie production, these experiences that are described in the Bible. What I discovered is that what I had been doing is sermon hunting. But the Bible is not a book of text.
Right.
So my preaching, I try to make my preaching grow out of my devotional life.
Yep.
Whenever I read any passage in the Bible, I keep notes on it. And what I do when I get ready to preach a sermon is go to my sermon seeds. I used to have 3-ring notebooks, but now, you know, with these devices, I catalog it in my little device. I go there and I see whatever speaks to me.
Yep.
And that's where I start. And couple with what's going on in the church, what's going on in the world. What do people need to hear at this time to encourage them or to challenge them to do this or that?
So tell me how you got to Harvard Divinity School in a preaching class with Gardner Taylor.
At Andover Newton, you're in the Boston area. And there were about, I think, 13 seminaries in the area. And they call it the BTI, the Boston Theological Institute. And what it allowed you to do is to take up to half of your courses. You could enroll, as I did in Andover Newton, but you could take up to half of your coursework in any or several of those schools. And so I took homiletics at Harvard with some other courses, but homiletics with Dr. Taylor.
So tell me about that experience of taking a preaching class from Dr. Taylor.
To say the least, it was awesome. I remember my first day going to the class, I was late. And when I got to the classroom, the door was partially open. And I pushed it open and stuck my head in, and Dr. Taylor said, Mr. Perkins? I said, yes. He said, come in, we've been waiting for you. That was how Dr. Taylor was, you know. So I went and I sat there, and at the end of the class, I asked him, how did you know that was me? He said, well, you were the only one missing. He looked at the row. I'll tell you another part in a minute about that led to him asking me if I had a car. I said yes, and he asked me to take him to the station where he could go catch the plane. And I did, and then he said, can we make a deal? Could you pick me up each Wednesday and transport me back and forth to the classroom? So I said yes. So I've developed a relationship with him. But the class was awesome because he would stand at the window and talk about the gospel. If God had written it upon the sky in bold letters across the sky, if he had written it in the wind so that it could be whispered out by the zephyr winds, you know, how flowery he was. Well, he would take those kinds of oratorical flights in describing the gospel and the mission of the preacher. But most important, I got out of that class a history of preaching. He would refer to preachers of 18th century, British, Scottish, Welsh preachers. And from that, after studying how rich those sermons were from those men in that era, then I started looking at Nat Turner and all of those black preachers.
Frederick
Douglass and so forth. And I asked myself, what did they preach to keep hope alive in the hearts of these slaves who didn't see any light of hope anywhere? Right. And in reading those old sermons like that, started to stir my spirit and influence me, you know?
Yeah.
And I didn't have a mentor as such. Right. And in St. Albans, West Virginia, you know, you're in a corner of the world where there aren't a whole lot of people you can talk to about how to develop a sermon. So in that lonely space, I just kind of crafted my own style and my own way of doing it. And I was trying to do it the best I could. So, you know, you evolve and you become what you are.
So did Dr. Taylor teach a preaching method?
He talked a little about methodology, not as much as he did the history of preaching and I guess the philosophy of preaching. He talked a little about methodology. How many points ought a sermon have? At least one. You know, he would talk that way, and he would tell us, you know, talk a little about the classic style of 3 points, you know, and a conclusion, but not as much. I basically got the art and craft of sermon construction at Andover Newton from Eddie O'Neill, who was that's where I got into the structure part of it. But Dr. Taylor's was a history of preaching, a theology of preaching, you know.
So I don't know why I thought you were doing the Hegelian method of Dr. Proctor.
Well,
am I?
Yes, I mean, you know, I guess I was doing the Hegelian method and didn't know it.
Yeah.
Because as Dr. Proctor, when he talks about this Hegelian method, the thesis or the antithesis thesis and so forth, and the relevant question, I was doing that.
Right.
You know, but I didn't have the theory behind what I was doing.
Right.
You know, but.
So tell me about the encounter with Dr. Proctor. You know, so you were in a group, right? You were in the.
I was in the first Proctor group.
Yes.
Which again was a blessing. I got invited to participate in this Proctor group. It was explained to me by Darrell Ward, who was dean at United Seminary at that time.
Dayton, Ohio.
And he asked me if I wanted to be a part of it. And at that time, acquiring a D-Min was becoming very popular, and I didn't have one. So I told him yes. And he told me that Dr. Proctor was going to be the mentor, professor, which was more inviting and intriguing. Then he started naming the people who were going to be in the class: Dr. Jeremiah Wright, Dr. Johnny Youngblood, Dr. Sue J. Johnson Cook, Dr. Otis Moss. And I said, yes, I definitely want to be in that class. You know, there were others. And here again, to sit there among that group, hear Dr. Proctor lecture. He talked again about his sermon method. The quivers, arrows in his quiver, you know. And you didn't ask him questions. You didn't talk to him, you listened. But, you know, we would have conversations, dialogue, discussions among ourselves. And just to have your thoughts pollinated by all of these great men and great insights, you know, was just rich. Right. And there are no words to describe it. And I miss Dr. Proctor, you know, and I wonder to myself from time to time, what would he be saying and challenging us to do in this environment that we're in now.
And I asked that, of course, because I was in the second group. We were the kiddies, or the juniors, as y'all used to refer to. This is the Mitchell Wheeler group. Y'all used to call us kiddies.
I see.
But we were attracted to the program because, of course, my relationship with Jeremiah Wright, he's my pastor. He kept telling me about it.
Right.
I said, I want to learn like that. Can I get in? I said, no, the group is already fixed, it's closed. And then they opened up a second group, and Henry Mitchell and Ed Wheeler Fellows, and changed my life. And
yes,
without getting too far, because people want to hear you, not me, but I ended up, Mitchell called out of me the teaching of preaching.
Yes.
I just went because I wanted to get better.
Sure.
As a pastor on a Sunday by Sunday basis.
Right.
And he saw it and called me out. So I have a special, and we used to see, I remember the first time, Dr. Proctor used to close the intensives because people would try to sneak out of there, but they put him at the end.
Yeah.
And just the fabulous sermons and the worship. So from there, I want you to, any other preaching mentors? I think I've got one, is Gardner Calvin Taylor. I've got Sam Pryor. Any other? And
well, Dr. William Augustus Jones.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, when I was a student at Wiley, there came a point toward the end of your time at the campus where they would send you to various seminaries. Mm-hmm. And so you could enroll in one of these seminaries, just exposure. I went to the conference at Colgate Rochester, and Dr. Jones was preaching. Well, for a boy from Williamson, West Virginia, I'd never heard any preaching like this, When I heard Dr. Taylor, I had never heard a preacher use that kind of language and so forth. We invited Dr. Jones to come to Wiley campus, and he did, he came. Then later on, when I became a pastor, I went to the Progressive Convention, and I saw Dr. Jones then, met him again, Mm-hmm. And for some reason, he took a liking to me. He said, will you come to Bethany? I said, yes, indeed. But he invited me to Bethany to do a youth day. And so thereafter, we developed a relationship. So there was him. Then there was Dr. Adams, Charles Adams. He was a manuscript preacher. Well, that made me feel good because I was a manuscript preacher too, So that gave me, again, a sense of legitimacy. And so those men are men that have, while they didn't directly mentor me, they've been men that I looked up to and tried to emulate and model my ministry after.
Yeah. So tell me about the Hampton Ministers Conference. And go ahead. We've had some of these conversations, so go ahead. Tell me about Hampton.
Well, of course Hampton is Hampton. That is the largest platform in this black preaching circle that you can have. It is the Lyman Beecher lectureship, for black folks, so to speak.
Right.
I was privileged, I don't remember the years, but I was privileged to preach at Hampton 3 times. I've never been so nervous in all of my life. The first time I preached was in Ogden Hall. And the Lord blessed the moment, especially like the second presentation that I made,
What was it, 3 days? You had 3 days. 3 days.
I
Okay.
had to preach 3 times.
So you were the morning preacher?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the first time, my first presentation, I was nervous and didn't feel like I had done well at all. The second one, the Lord blessed the moment. And then the third one is what sometimes I bump into fellows who remember it I did this sermon, The Bridegroom's Friend. And so the Lord blessed that. I got invited back again. This time it was for the 75th session of Hampton. And the other preachers were Dr. Taylor and Dr. Proctor. Needless to say, here again, and I was sandwiched between them. So I would say, well, that's okay. I knew another man whom they hang between two thieves. Then the last time, most recently, again, the nervousness got the best of me. But on that occasion, I made a terrible flaw because I grabbed the wrong manuscript without realizing it. Wow. And got up there and was trying to read something that I didn't intend to present at all, Right. But then once I saw, you can't say, let me go back here and get the right. That's right. So, but Hampton is a great honor. And to have been invited 3 times, needless to say, but it is also the most terrifying preaching moment, because you got the greatest preachers in the world sitting right there before you, listening to you. And as we're prone to do, we'll critique. Yeah. But I don't pay that any attention, even the critiquing, because the fact is you're there. You can only be who you are. That's right. And what you do is what you do. And you do, as the kids say now, you do you. Right. And I'll do me, Right. So I just do me, and God be praised.
I appreciate you talking about leaving the manuscript, because there's a human element always in preaching, and there's, particularly these kinds of occasions, and thinking about not doing well, and it's the occasion can be so monumental and so big and so anxiety provoking. And I think I've heard you preach so many times. I mean, just it's one time. It's just one time.
Yeah.
It's just one time.
Yes.
And we can make one time big, and it's just one time. I don't care how big the audience is, it's just one time. And, fabulous preaching. I mean, and thank you for helping my audience understand that it's just one time.
Yes.
And despite our best efforts, we're still human, God still blesses, and we keep moving. So, I wouldn't, if you hadn't told me, I would not have known that. I was preaching with you that last time. I was a morning preacher that.
I remember.
And you were noonday.
That's right.
Right, I remember. I want to ask you about, is there a time when you preached that God really used you? I mean, in terms of, you felt, we're humble as preachers.
Sure.
Sometimes it's false, but we're humble. So when was there a time that you knew that God used you? It was beyond what you could have even anticipated or expected. It was beyond, you just knew it was pure God.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would mention 2 times. One was early in my ministry. I got invited to preach an afternoon service, and here again, this is in St. Albans, West Virginia. And I went, and while I was preaching, I had an out-of-body experience. I mean, I got so full in the preaching that it was like me and the Lord were standing on the side watching me preach. I'd never experienced that, but I've chased that experience all my ministry. It's happened maybe 4 or 5 times in 50 years, But that would be one, because that's etched in my spirit.
Do you remember the sermon?
The stability and endurability of the church. Upon this rock I will build my church. The second time was in 1979. Here again, Dr. Jones was president of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, and he asked me to preach on Wednesday night in the Progressive Convention in 1979. I wasn't 30 years old.
Wow.
In New Orleans, in the Superdome. And in those days, we filled up the Superdome and there was standing room only. And here again, this was pre-Hampton.
Right.
So that was a terrifying experience. But the Lord blessed the moment. And I've been preaching somewhere every week since. You know, but Dr. Jones again took a liking to me for some reason and allowed me to do that, you know, when he could have invited Charles at anybody.
Right.
But that was a critical moment in my ministry because it exposed me, and like I said, I've been preaching somewhere ever since.
So do you remember the sermon in the text?
Yes, that sermon was called Metamorphosis. Beloved, now are we the sons of God. It doth not yet appear what we shall be, but when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And I talked about metamorphosis, you know, using the illustration of a butterfly, you know, which came at the end. But yep, I remember those sermons.
So go to the other side. What were some or the most difficult time that you had to preach? It could be anything, family, personal, church. I mean, it was really a difficult time.
Well, here again, I'll give you two illustrations. One is when my mother died. That weekend, I had been invited from Detroit to my little home church in West Virginia to preach that morning. So my dad and I had gone to the church, and my wife was going to drive my mother. So I'm sitting in the church waiting for her to come in, and they never showed up. I saw my brother-in-law come into the church, and he went around and he whispered something in my father's ear. And my father got up and he waved his hand as if to say, I'll see you later. And they left the church. He came around, my brother-in-law, whispered something in the pastor's ear, and the pastor just went back and sat down. The choir was singing and it was time for me to get up. And I said, something has happened here, but I didn't know what it was. And so I got up, and it was just like I was talking, but it was all a reverb in my head. It felt like my blood had turned to ice water in my veins, you know. And so I was talking, but I didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't even focused on that. Afterwards, I learned that my mother had had a stroke, and my wife had had to rush her to the hospital, and she was in the hospital, and later on she did pass away. But that was one of the moments. I had so looked forward to being at my home church, having my mom and dad there. They didn't get to hear me that often. And it just didn't happen. Another time was what I referenced a moment ago at Hampton when I grabbed the wrong sermon, you know. That was painful and embarrassing, and like you said, they may not have known it was what I didn't intend to preach, but it didn't matter. I felt it. And so that was kind of a torturous moment, you know. But here again, as you said, it's only one time.
So, let's stop there for a minute. And, so how, as preachers, we all have those moments, so how did you get through it?
Prayer, prayer and my family, because I would say to them, oh, I missed it, They would say, well, Daddy, or my wife would say, well, that's okay, you did fine, it was, they try to console you. And then just prayer, just sitting there saying, Lord, please forgive me, and, and accepting his forgiveness. Right. See, because this scripture says, if your heart condemns you, God is greater than your heart. And in moments when I feel like I messed up, that scripture always comes to mind and gives me a sense of freedom again.
That's a beautiful text. I love that text.
Yes.
Joe Ratliff gave me that text. Call me up.
Yeah. Okay.
Call me up, Frank. I got a text for you. So I have a sermon out of that text. I did it at a suicide.
Wow.
Even when our hearts condemn us. Anyway, so again, they're here to talk to you about you. So, all right. So tell me about hooping. Do you consider yourself a hooper, or tell me about it?
I do not consider myself a hooper, and I wish I could hoop. I guess all African American preachers wish they could hoop. Right. I listen to hoopers, but I heard Dr. Sandy Ray say it one time, and as it relates to hooping, the best gravy is that gravy that comes right out of the meat, not this canned gravy. He said, you can go to the store and you can buy some canned gravy, but the best gravy is that gravy that comes right out the meat. What I think is a well-developed and delivered sermon that is cogent, that hangs together, there's a logical conclusion. Therefore, and if you can master the therefores and the imagery. See, behind every text is a picture. Hebrew is a picturesque language. Greek is a picturesque language. So what is the image behind this? And if you can work that metaphor and work the image, that to me pounds the message home. Right. It doesn't always need hooping, right. But I don't criticize people who hoop. I love to hear it. It stirs my spirit. Mm-hmm. If I have been fed, through the development and presentation of the sermon.
So how would you describe your clothes?
I would describe my clothes, first of all, as I just mentioned, trying to be consistent with the text and pushing it home. Right. But I think it's proclamation and exhortation. Right. At the end. It is. And it's energy. Right. You expound energy. Yes. So, while it isn't hooping, it's still.
See, but you haven't talked about the music in your voice. It may not be hooping, but there's music in your voice. You haven't talked about the cadence that you've mastered. You haven't talked about your ability just to raise your own self and raise through the word people. I had you for revival, so I've seen it, I've felt it, I know it. So you haven't talked about any of that. I got all of that, but there's another dimension here that I want you to talk about. Well,
you're helping me to understand myself then, because I haven't thought of it in terms of my having music in my voice, Here again, in terms of my cadence, I do want a cadence. Mm-hmm. I developed that again in West Virginia. Right. Okay. Because I had a church where the people didn't say amen. And I had to keep time for myself, Right. So I developed this habit of pounding my feet. That's how I keep my rhythm and my cadence going, But my language also has to match it. It has to flow. Right. I want my language to flow, The most important part of the sermon to get me started is the first sentence. It's got to be the right sentence. Right. Once I get the right sentence, and the language is rhythmic, that's what I want,
You have a little bounce, and it's distinct, right? Yeah. So I catch your bounce. You bounce a little bit. And so, I remember saying, leaning over to the preacher, I said, now, wait on him. This bounce is getting ready to, and the rhythm. Yeah. And it's a powerful, and not only the close, but just your analysis, and you do a lot of social justice work.
Yes.
In your sermons.
Yes.
Talk about social events and
yes.
African American people, and
yes.
Just so you're a complete.
In Detroit, they have nicknamed me Percolator.
Mm-hmm. See?
And so in reference to what you're suggesting, the rhythm, when they call me percolator, that's what they mean. He starts low and it's like, and then explodes. Right. So I guess that's how I would characterize the conclusion of my sermon.
I appreciate that, because we love the art and craft of preaching. We love the method of preaching. And our goal is to, of course, help younger preachers, get better and hear and the stories and the tradition. So talk a little bit about the African American preaching tradition, because we had some discussion already. What does it mean to you?
Well, here again, when I took Dr. Taylor's homiletics class, and he exposed me, as I mentioned, to all of these 18th century European preachers, I started looking at African American preaching, just going back and reading sermons, David Walker, all of those, Henry
McNeil
Turner, yes, all of those sermons. Because what has always been in my mind is, how did black people come all the way from Africa? They broke them up in terms of any common dialect. They didn't want them to have any way of connecting. And how is it that they connected and couldn't read the Bible, and yet somehow got the Bible story from the master and reinterpreted? And what would the slave preacher say that kept hope alive in the hearts of those enslaved people who had no hope? I mean, this was over 200 years. Right. And they kept praying and saying, Lord, deliver us, and deliverance didn't come. Right. So what did the preacher preach? What set him on fire? Yeah. Well, when you read those sources and you see how they had faith in God and how they encouraged the people and the picturesque language and so forth they would use, it's important to me that I understand that tradition, because there's a line of continuity, especially in terms of the message. God is a deliverer from oppression that needs to be consistent. Right. And I have seen a generation of preachers not connect with that tradition, but instead have connected with this quote-unquote word church thing, which is backwoods, white preachers, and introduced that into the African American church, which I think is a misnomer, because it misses Eddie Glaude says in one book that the black church is dead. And what he meant by that, as I interpret it, is when we get away from focusing on social justice and focusing on the justice theme of the Bible and Jesus as liberator, there is no black church. That is our uniqueness and our distinctiveness. Yes. And that message needs to continue, especially in this political atmosphere that we're in right now. So I think it's important for us to connect with tradition, because that's what birthed us. Yes. And we are birthed to continue it.
Right. That's right. Oh, thank you for that. I it's a gift to us all. I mean, so it's like we don't realize that this text has been preached. So if you preach Psalm 13, at least 2,000 years. That text has been preached. Yes. If not longer, if you go beyond. So for us to walk in and start and ignore all of that. Right. It's been preached for 400 years in the black church. That's right. So for us to ignore all of that, and so it's important. It's a gift to us all. And I'll say this, and I say this when I in classes when I teach Martin Luther King, and I say, we've had thousands of Martin Luther King Juniors. Now it happened that this Martin Luther King was for this time and this season. That's right. But no preacher is greater than the tradition. That's right. That's exactly right. we don't create sermons out of nothing.
That's right.
There's been materials that have been passed. You sat as a young person sitting there looking at the preacher. Stuff has been passed on to you.
Yes.
And so we're trying to treasure, to archive, to keep alive, to study, to research. And what I believe is one of the few hopes for revival in America, that Africa, the genius and the beauty and the depth and the power of African American preaching can generate a preaching renaissance to revive American Christianity. And Lord knows American Christianity needs revival.
That's right. And so do our people, especially in this time. We're just coming out of a pandemic which was depressing to all of our spirits. Yeah. And the political atmosphere, I'm afraid for my grandchildren. Here we are talking about becoming a autocratic government as opposed to a democratic government. Right. What in the world does that mean? That you have a tyrant as a president? So preaching is needed now. It's an emergency. Right. Where do people go for hope? I'm hearing the statistics going up for suicides among teens. Mm-hmm. Where is the disconnect? Mm-hmm. And in other words, there's a void here that is begging for a prophetic voice, yes. A delivering, healing voice. Yes. And that's what the black church needs to do and be at this time.
Right. So after 50 years of preaching, I'll give these final moments to you to say whatever you'd like to say. After 50 years, what shall you say to these things? That God is real, that God is a deliverer, and that God does hear and answer prayer. And what you're doing in terms of developing this legacy and archiving it is so essential. And I pray that this generation of preachers and the succeeding generation of preachers will have an appreciation for what you're doing here, because you're passing the tradition on, but more than that, you're giving an intellectual framework, for them to understand what it is, how to do it, right. And why it's needed. Okay, well, thank you, man. Thank you for, I think, it occurred to me, I didn't ask you about retirement. I didn't ask you about any of that, so let me backtrack and pick that up. Tell me about that.
Well, number one, during the pandemic, and I could have mentioned this as one of those moments when I didn't feel like my preaching was at its best, because all of a sudden I found myself preaching to a red light. Mm-hmm. And, as I mentioned, I'm a manuscript preacher, so I tried doing that initially, and it was just very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Who am I talking? You can't see faces. So I started doing preaching without the manuscript, which was uncomfortable for me, but I did it anyway. Well, coming out of that, I realized that it was going to take a lot of hard work to get people back in the church. And then you got to build up your online audience. Yeah. Given my age, given the number of years I had been at this church and feeling where the church needed to go, I didn't feel like I had enough in the tank, to be able to do what ought to be done. Yeah. And I prayed about it, and the Lord gave me release. And I said, well, it's better to get out of the way than be in the way. Yeah. And plus, as I mentioned, all of my ministry, I've been blessed to be invited in, and my wife and I are getting up in years. I have grandchildren. I don't want them just to remember me standing in the pulpit with a robe on, as they put it, hollering at people. So I said, well, and I had a serious health challenge and nearly died. So I said, well, I need to step aside, let a young, energetic pastor come in, take the people to where they need to go, and I can spend more time with my family and my grandchildren, so they'll have a sense of granddad. Yeah. And so I did it at the end of 2022, and it's been good. I've been invited to preach, and don't have the burden and the responsibility of all of the administration, etc. So God be praised.
Well, God be praised. Well done, good and faithful servant.
Bless you, sir.
Thank you for your time, sir, and this is going to help a lot of people.
Well,
and we love you deeply, and thanks for the years and years of relationship. Thanks for coming to me when I asked you to come and show up, and I had to preach after you. That was kind of tough, but so
man.
thanks, man.
Thank you, Doc. God bless you.